Hello, eighth graders. All right, let's pick up where we left off on these. Um, I think these notes that I have posted. I think are gonna take us all the way through the end of the school year. I don't think I'm gonna post other notes. We might just do book stuff in the final weeks. Um, so we're not gonna rush through the rest of these this time. It'll probably be another video or two. We left off talking about the Korean War, right, and that push northward. In North Korea, which resulted with, China responding, getting involved, led to the whole MacArthur-Truman conflict, right? Election of 1952 comes around, and Americans want the stalemate in Korea to be over. They just want out of that conflict. And General Dwight D. Eisenhower runs for president. He's a war hero, right? World War II, big name guy. Promises to bring an end to the conflict if he's elected. He does, play a role in a ceasefire being signed, but it takes over a year as president until he gets that done. So it still takes a little bit of time. People are not super thrilled about that. And technically, that ceasefire is still standing today. The Korean War never has had a official resolution. They're still technically at like a temporary truce that's just lasted for decades, right? That's why it's still a conflicted area today, right? But people are happy with this. It got us out of that conflict. Made it look like things were making a turn for the better. We then go into what's called the Second Red Scare. So this is the big Red Scare. There was that minor one before. This one is by far a more widespread issue in America. This fear of communism grows to pretty huge extremes. You have people who are so paranoid that communists infiltrated parts of government, areas of the United States that you wouldn't expect to have to worry about communism in, to the point where they create a committee called the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC. It was created to investigate potential communists within the United States. And it was even prevalent in Hollywood. So where people were concerned about there being propaganda in TV and movies, or actors or actresses who might have supported communism, to the point where they create a literal blacklist, a list of actors or actresses who they have considered to be potentially communist or in support of communism, and they are banned from jobs. So if you got your name put on this list, no one would hire you. And it's not like a publicly available list. It's a list that directors and casting people had, sort of secret. And because of that, there are certainly some people on that list that probably were not secret communists or communist sympathizers, right? It's very easy to you can accuse someone of being one. It's hard to prove you're not one, right? It's hard to prove that you're not a secret communist. How do you prove that? And it ruins the career of some people in Hollywood, and goes to show how deep this paranoia has reached, right? Unfortunately for the United States at this time, we've got the Rosenbergs. So the atomic bomb, the atom bomb, the weapon that the Soviets wanted that we didn't give to them, they end up getting it during this Cold War period, because Soviet spies begin to leak that research to Russians. And the Rosenberg couple are two people who are put to death. They are executed for providing Soviet spies with secret details of designs of the bomb, right? They're considered Soviet spies, espionage, right? The fact that they stole this information and allowed a potential enemy or adversary, a rival country, to get it, put a lot of people's lives in danger, right? You have to imagine, if you are the average American in this time period, people are afraid of Russia. They're concerned about communism and this other powerful country. And then you find out now that Russia has access to the most powerful weapon ever created. You can kind of see where some of that paranoia is coming from. People are genuinely afraid, and people like the Rosenbergs, who assisted in that, giving out of the secret designs, they were seen as huge public enemies, right? People were absolutely horrified that something like this would happen. There's a lot of concern that there's no guarantees the Russians were going to be reasonable with this weapon, right? I mean, some people were under the impression the Russians were going to, fire these missiles at us the second they had them available, right? Obviously they didn't. We're still here, but I mean, it's a legitimate concern for people in the United States and in the United States, government, because you can't guarantee that you know what someone's going to do, right? Building off of that paranoia comes Senator Joseph McCarthy. So he is a Wisconsin senator who made some really bold claims. Sometimes you'll hear the word McCarthyism thrown around, and it's because he kind of has a really rapid rise and fall in the United States. He becomes super, super popular because he goes on news and on television in front of reporters and claims that he knows that there are secret communists who have infiltrated the United States government. He says there are communists at every level of the government that he has a list of possible suspects, and it's it's really bad. And he even says that they've infiltrated the military, and he gets a huge amount of support. People remember it's kind of like this group paranoia, this fear, right? There's a lot of support for McCarthy at the time, and people supported him opening investigations and his list of names. Thing is, the list of names are just people's names, right? He doesn't have, if he had hard concrete evidence of these 57 people, being communists, there would need to be an investigation, right? And one of the big mistakes he makes is that when he investigates the military, when he's making these accusations against the military, they televise the entire thing. And it sort of starts to reveal that he was kind of playing the crowd, right? He was kind of playing the American people up, making claims that he didn't have evidence to back just to get public support, to get people behind him, to get power, right? And for a while, he was very, very powerful. During this Red Scare, just the accusation of being a communist could cost you your job, right? Someone could just accuse you of being a communist. If you had no proof, they would still fire you in some of these places. Neighbors were like reporting on each other, like spying on one another. It was a weird time, and he sort of is an example of someone who's taking advantage of that, right? And by the end of it, he becomes a very unpopular guy in America once people sort of figure out, that he's not necessarily providing a lot of proof, right? But it's sort of an example of that mob mentality, right? People gathering around, upset about something, sort of gets away from itself, right? You can't control it anymore. Also, we've talked about the creation of, at this point in time, the hydrogen bomb. So the hydrogen bomb is just a stronger, more powerful nuclear device, right? And it was like sort of an arms race. Now the Soviets had the atomic weapon. We want to make it even bigger, more powerful weapon, right? We did a lot of testing in the South Pacific with these explosives, and these are massively powerful devices. We've now, since then, up to modern day, we've tested, nuclear bombs on the surface, just out in a desert. We've done that before. We've tested them in the ocean. We dropped them on empty islands to see the effects. We've tested them underwater in the ocean, and we've tested them underground. And everywhere you test a nuclear device is bad for the environment. That shouldn't shock you, right? If you test something that puts nuclear fallout into the air and it blows around, it has a lot of bad effects. When they tested it at ground level, there are some areas in the southwest of the United States that you can't live today. It's still radioactive, right? Depending on wind patterns, there are towns nearby that people suffered, health problems from these testings. When they tested things underground, it turns out, in a way, it's almost worse. The nuclear radiation things can sort of last longer. It can get into water supplies. That's a big problem. Still in parts of the United States where they tested today. There are islands that still have some pretty big problems, but underwater is the same thing, right? You kill a lot of fish, but you also contaminate a lot of that ocean water. And so sort of everywhere you test nuclear weapons is bad. There's no good place to test them. We have signed a treaty that says we're not going to test them in space. That was another idea for a while, but we don't really know fully what the effects of exploding a nuclear device in space would be, right? But there's a lot of tests being done, and there's actually a great documentary, and I can't remember the name of it. But there are islands out in the South Pacific where we took some of our remaining sort of defunct nuclear weapons, ones that weren't fully functional, residue, things that are left over from creating some of these, and we sort of left them on semi-high-tech garbage dumps. We created these like bunkers in some of these islands that we stored, these old weapons in. And I can't remember the name of the documentary, but there's one about how some of these islands have huge contamination problems, and the United States hasn't cleaned it up still. That they have like health centers the U.S. put there for people who live there so they could test to make sure they're not being exposed to radiation, and like the machines don't work. And the concrete bunkers they had like stored this nuclear waste in are like leaking. And so it's still a problem today, the leftovers of some of these tests of things like these hydrogen bombs. But what it creates is like this paranoia in the United States where people were really scared about potential nuclear attacks. When I post this video, I'll also link the Bert the Turtle video, because when kids were in school, they had bomb drills. Like we have fire drills and tornado drills. They had little drills of what to do if there's a nuclear attack, but the big problem is there's nothing you could really do, right? If a nuclear weapon drops like 5 miles outside your school, there's no amount of preparation can save you from that. But kids are worried. They had kids like, parents didn't want to send their kids to school. There's concerns about nuclear attacks. So the government released this video that explains if there's a nuclear bomb, you just need to duck and cover. Cover your skin. Don't look at the explosion, and you'll be fine, right? Obviously, that will not save your life. Ducking and covering, nuclear bomb goes off, will not do anything. Some of you think I've seen this video before because I showed it to 8th grade last year. But I'll post it with this. It's a really weird, kind of creepy video. It's funny now. Like watching that video, it's kind of goofy and funny, but like put yourself in the perspective of they showed that to kids in grade school, right? They practiced those drills. To them, it was very real. And they did it not because they thought ducking and covering would protect you. It was to make the kids feel safer, right? Like, look, now you know what you can do. You're safe, but you're not, right? It's just for the mentality's sake. And so people were growing up in a time period where they were under the threat of a nuclear strike happening anytime. Americans built bunkers like the one pictured here. They planned for a potential like apocalypse-like scenario. And it's really sort of surreal to think about because it's something we don't live in a world nowadays where we have to worry about, potentially being nuked at any time, right? But that's what America was like at that point. So it was this culture of paranoia and fear. What didn't help is old Sputnik here. Sputnik is the first artificial satellite sent into space, orbited the planet. The Soviets beat us to this in terms of the space race. It's actually about the size of a volleyball with 4 little antennae. That's it. All it did was beep. It orbited the Earth and it beeped at set times. And you could actually pick it up on a radio. If you tune your radio to the right frequency, you could actually pick up the signals that Sputnik had sent out. And this was part of that sort of race between the Americans and the Soviet Union in terms of like getting someone to space, potentially landing on the moon, which is coming up, that kind of stuff. And Sputnik is seen as a huge success for the Soviet Union, right? Scientifically, it's a very impressive feat. They put something that orbited the Earth, right? But the real scary part about Sputnik isn't that it's orbiting and beeping. It's that it shows what the Soviets are capable of, right? If they can put a satellite in space, that means that they have rockets capable of getting something out of the atmosphere, right? If they can put a little volleyball in there, what's stopping them from putting a nuclear warhead on one of those missiles, right? There were people who were paranoid that Sputnik was like a secret attack satellite, that it could launch attacks from space. It's not true, right? But again, that shows what people were worried about. And it caused huge amounts of hysteria. You could actually see it in the night sky as it went across. Americans were absolutely terrified. When I student taught, the teacher who came to like evaluate me from the college, he grew up during the Cold War and went to school during that time, and I taught this lesson, not this lesson because we have to do it weird because COVID, but when I taught about this, he shared with the class like what it was like, and how he and his family reacted to it. I mean, it's scary stuff, right? We know now looking back on it, it's a harmless satellite, but the time period, it'd be hard to make people sort of believe that, right? Simultaneously, I've talked about this idea of brinksmanship. We talked about it earlier in this unit too. This idea of like, we get right to the edge of war with the Soviet Union, And then we see how they react, right? Or they get right to the edge of war with us to see how we react. And this is known as brinkmanship, right? Bringing something right to the edge of war, but not full war. And it's sort of the way that we treat the Soviets. We think that the best way to handle them is you can't show weakness. You have to show that strength, that fact that you're not afraid to, fight if you have to. And Eisenhower's a big believer in this. It had been working decently so far, but it does cause increasing hostility, right? And at the same time, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, is going to begin to remove communist leaders from other countries. They're going to begin to interfere with the sovereignty or the independence of some of these countries in the Soviet Union, which is going to cause some additional problems, right? And this is where, when you talk about that idea of like proxy wars, like not fighting the Soviets directly, fighting through other countries, that's where you're going to look at things like later on Afghanistan in the Middle East, things where you have the U.S. back at one side, Soviets back in the other. Same thing with what happened in Korea is going to happen in other countries. And that's an ongoing thing throughout the Cold War. And one big crisis we're talking about is the Suez crisis. That Suez Canal in Egypt was historically something very important, right? Connects the Mediterranean to a series of lakes that could sort of take you towards the Indian Ocean. It was a major trade route through the area. Technically, it belonged to the British. So after World War II, it became fully under the control of the British government. British government over time has gotten a little bit weaker. And the Egyptian leadership at the time, during this Cold War period, nationalizes the canal, takes it over, kicks the British out. British are very upset. The Israelis invade Egypt. The Soviets threaten to come in and remove the Israelis by force. The United States is very concerned. We're allies with Israel. We're worried if the Russians come in and attack Israel that we will be sort of forced to come in and defend Israel, and then boom, we have World War III. Luckily for the United States and the Soviet Union, we both kind of come to an agreement to publicly condemn Israel's attack. So both the United States and the Soviet Union say Israel should not have attacked Egypt. Egypt can do what it wants with the Suez Canal. And it's a way of avoiding the conflict escalating. So it's one example of we didn't actually go to the brink on this particular issue. I also put it on here because in terms of if this were like a British history class, Suez Crisis is a big issue for the monarchy in England. This was during this time period. There was a huge push to get rid of having a queen and a royal family altogether. And the way that the queen sort of handled the public backlash of this whole situation is one of the reasons why they still have a queen in England today. So she sort of restored public faith a little bit in the monarchy during this, but it could have went a much different way. So it's an example of definitely a change of pace, right? Controversial time. All right, there's one more thing I want to talk about, and that's the old baby boomers. Okay, going into a Cold War, post World War II economy, we talked about how there was that surge in people buying like luxury goods again, restocking on the pots and pans, things they had given up during World War II. But it's more than just that. We have, during this time period, a huge jump in birth rate. People begin to have more children. Children are living longer. You're having less infant deaths. You're having people starting families at earlier, ages than before. And so that whole red period in this graph is a period of time where the birth rate is pretty increased in the United States. And it's a good thing and a bad thing, right? The baby boom at times in the United States has been very good. You can think of, you have this huge number of children. Think of what that does to the economy. That increases spending, right? You're buying more clothes for your kids. You're buying that kind of stuff. When they go to schools, there's a greater demand for schools. So for a period of 10 or so years, teachers become very widely sought after as these schools have to expand. And then as they grow older and they go into the workforce, right, it's great for the economy to have more workers than ever before, right? nowadays, in current America, we are reaching baby boomers are now retiring, right? Which comes with its own help and hurt with the economy, right? The nice parts is they're going and buying, nice retirement homes and going on trips and stuff, and that's helping local economies and vacation areas and stuff, right? But it also means that there's less of them working now. More of them are hitting the age to draw Social Security. It's causing all sorts of widespread, long-term economic issues. So the baby boomers are still around, still causing issues at times, we'll say, right? But the population in the United States begins to rapidly grow, and with that, we're going to have some growing pains, right? Not everything's going to be necessarily ideal in this going forward. We will stop it here today. Make sure that you complete the chapter review on Friday. Thank you.